Good morning. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for coming. We have a wonderful program for you this morning. And I should mention this is part of our series on internal developments in Russia. We began with a session in October on demography in Russia, and this, of course, on politics. Next month, we're doing a session on the Russian economy, followed by a session probably in April on energy sector in Russia. We have a real treat for you this morning. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers. I will not describe them except to say Yevgenia Albats, a top-notch journalist from Moscow, has written a very provocative and fascinating paper on whither Russia politically. Foreign Minister Kozyrev will comment on that, as will Eugene Rumer from Carnegie, and Ambassador and former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Sandy Vershbow, will bat cleanup for us this morning. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Albats.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Mr. Ambassador Herbst, who invited me and who asked me to write a paper to the Atlantic Council and its Eurasia Center. And thank you very much all for coming for this event. Institutional persistence, that's the main topic of the paper that I wrote at the request of the Atlantic Council. And in this paper, I argue that we have been witnessing the transformation of the regime in Russia from the personalistic authoritarian regime to the corporativist type of regime, which is known in history in Italy of the Mussolini, Franco Spain, and Salazar's Portugal. To be sure, there is no any le carré in my story. There is no any conspiracy in the story that I'm outlining. I'm just arguing that when Vladimir Putin has become the president of the Russian Federation in 2000, he brought with himself the whole range of people from his old job, the KGB, and over the years, in a period of 8 years, first 8 years, they staffed all the layers of the Russian government, the apparatus of the government, the apparatus of the presidential administration. As a result, by 2008, almost 67% of all positions in the top layer of the Russian nomenclature were occupied by the graduates of the Soviet Union's political police, the KGB, army officers, and some people from the military intelligence group. By 2015, it became vivid, also very vivid in the public sphere, that the country is pretty much run by the people who grew up inside the Soviet Union political police, or by their sons and daughters. That we have been witnessing the formation of the whole clan of people who are united by the common background, common education, argot, by the special code of ethics, by their understanding of what is right is what is wrong, and even by the inferior complex that they developed after the Soviet Union collapsed and the new Russia came about. As a result, just to put it in comparative perspective, in 1999, the last year Yeltsin was the president of the Russian Federation. After, and as you well aware, in the late December, he announced Prime Minister Putin as his successor. There were 46.7% of all bureaucratic positions that were occupied by the graduates of by those whom we usually call siloviki. That's once again, the KGB, the graduates of the KGB, GRU, and the army. As I said, 10 years later, the number rose to 66.7%. It is 14 times more that the amount of bureaucratic positions that people from the Soviet Union's KGB had in 1989, when Gorbachev was the leader of the country. Obviously, when you have this overrepresentation of people from one institution in all spheres of in all layers of the government, they bring with themselves their institutional culture. They bring with themselves their understanding of what is good and what is wrong in internal and external politics. They bring with themselves, the instruments that they used and they were useful back at the times when they were young and brave and strong, and everything was pretty much good for them in terms of the career-wise. Besides the numbers, there is also a clear-cut rise in the current success of the KGB, the FSB, capacities to influence the internal politics by using the means of coercion and repression. Once again, there is nothing special about Russia in that respect. By the way, I argue that these political culture models that argue that Russia sees itself as a special entity, as the one who has the special mission in the world, and therefore there is everything very special about Russia. However, from the political science of view, there is nothing special about Russia. In fact, from the political science of view, this kind of the regime is very well known in South America, and it was Guillermo O'Donnell, the famous Argentinian political scientist, who first coined this term bureaucratic authoritarianism. It is the type of the regime which is built on the coalition of, in case of South America, Latin America, military; in case of Russia, it's people predominantly from the KGB, and bureaucrats, technocrats who are running the everyday operations. So in that respect, there is nothing special, nothing new, what we are witnessing right now in Russia. So as I said, that we see the rise of the FSB activities in terms of all kind of coercion and violence. And that's a definitive feature of that type of regimes, when the notion of the primacy of the state interests make this military part of the coalition to use violence over rule of law, coercion over the rule of law. That's a very specific and very definitive feature of that type of regimes, and that's exactly what you see in Russia. Since 2012, there is eightfold rise of so-called terrorist cases that are investigated and persecuted by the FSB in Russia. Threefold rise of cases on extremism, which is a nowadays substitution for the anti-Soviet propaganda cases that existed back in the Soviet times. That's, I'm citing the paper, the brilliant paper, brilliant research that was done by Nikolai Petrov, formerly with Carnegie and now with the High School of Economics, and Kirill Rogov, a well-known columnist and writer in Russia. They wrote this paper for the university, the High School of Economics, and it was never published there. They were unable to publish it there. They were unable to publish it anywhere but in my magazine, The New Times. Most vividly, the rise of the FSB activities as a vehicle of coercion and violence is seen in all these cases, in the new cases against nomenclatura. As a result, 10 governors and deputies to governors, and in fact, 20. The number now that 26 deputy governors are under criminal investigations, and 4 governors are sitting in jails awaiting trials. There is Kozyrev, mayors and deputy mayors who are also under investigation from the side of this FSB. Inside the Department of Internal Security of the FSB, there has been created what we call, what was coined in the Russian media, Sechinsky Spetsnaz. Igor Sechin is the head of the Russian biggest and the world's biggest oil company, Rosneft. At the same time, he has been, when he was a vice prime minister, he helped to finance and to create this very special department inside the very special department who is conducting investigations against Russian nomenclatura. Sure enough, there is, immense corruption in the Russian Federation, and probably many of those who are under investigation have been involved in all kinds of illegal activities. The question is not the fact that they are investigated. The question is how those who were investigated were chosen. Because you see that it's not just a random choice, right? You clearly see that all those who were governors who were appointed, for instance, by the the one-time substitute for Putin by Dmitry Medvedev, all of them, they either fired or they are under criminal investigation right now. Nikita Belikh, the former governor of Kirovsky Oblast, the poorest region of the Russian Federation, who went to had problems with the local FSB, now is awaiting 10-year sentence in Lefortovo jail. Now, consequences. It's a long talk. What the future this brings to Russia. I just want to point to you that there are good and bad news. Good news is that personalistic types of regimes tend to be more unpredictable and more prone to all kind of war of revenge with the neighbors, like it happened in case, for instance, of annexation of Crimea or the war in the eastern Ukraine. Corporativist type of regimes, they're more stable. They are more persistent, and unfortunately, they are more consolidated. Therefore, it's much more difficult to expect, positive change in Russia. I will be happy to answer your questions with respect to the specific features of these regimes. Here, I would just say that. There is one very interesting feature that we observe now among this new Russian nomenclatura. Obviously, those who were KGB officers in the Soviet times, they're already in their mid-60s, and some of them even older than that, and they have their children who also already joined the ranks, or many of them joined the ranks of the top Russian nomenclatura. We call it, there is, almost heredity. Heredity. Yes, heredity capitalism. That is that, these children of the KGB nomenclatura, they take over the banks, big banks, especially, state-owned banks, corporations, and et cetera, et cetera. By the way, 10 heads of the state-owned or state-affiliated corporations are led by the graduates of the KGB. 25 agencies, heads of agencies, governmental agencies, or deputy heads of the governmental agencies are led by the graduates of the KGB. But talking about their children, what is very interesting about that is that many of them, they went through the boarding schools in the West, and some of them went through the colleges and the universities in the West. I don't want to imply that they necessarily absorbed the values of the Western democracy. We're well aware that, that a lot of dictators from different parts of the world, they prefer their kids to study in the universities in United Kingdom or in the United States. However, what is important is that my theory, my hypothesis, is that these children who got the education and got experience of living in the West, they wouldn't really want to live in the closed cell by the name Russia out there. I would think that they would like their children to be educated in the West because they're pretty much aware about the level of education inside Russia, which unfortunately is not good, especially in terms of humanities and political science, just a disaster. They would like to have their small children to go through boarding schools in Switzerland and United Kingdom. They would rather, the model that existed now is that they're making money inside Russia, but prefer to live outside Russia. They have their assets there, property, real estate, villas, and et cetera, et cetera. So, as it was a case at the last decade of the Soviet Union when children of nomenclatura were some sort of a vehicle in opening the country, I believe that this can be the vehicle in bringing change and democratic development, or at least some signs of the possibility of democratic development in Russia. Again, I would stop here. I just want, just briefly, there is a book that I love the most. And that's, I think, that, political scientists at large overlooked this Alexis de Tocqueville book, which is called The Old Regime and the French Revolution. I would just allow, talking about, of course, institutional persistence, that's a hell of a lot of literature written. Of course, Why Nations Fail by Asmaglo and Robinson is one of the latest hit, which basically refers to the same, problem of institutional persistence in different countries. But I just believe that Tocqueville's study of the failure of the French Revolution is just extremely applicable to the situation with the failure of the democratic revolution in Russia. I'm convinced, writes Tocqueville, that though they had no inkling of this, they took over from the old regime not only most of its customs, conventions, and modes of thought, but even those very ideas which prompted our revolutionaries to destroy it. That, in fact, though nothing was further from their intentions, they used the debris of the old order for building up the new one. That's exactly what happened in Russia in 1990s. They used the debris of the old order for building up the new one. And now we're dealing with the consequences. Thank you.
There's your vehicle. There's your vehicle.
No.
Okay, we'll talk about that later. Okay, Mr. Minister, your comments, please.
Thank you. Do you hear me? I was known for being soft-spoken and usually criticized by the opposition for that. If you expect argument and fight here, you will be probably disappointed, because when I entered in the room this morning, I said, I like your research to Zhenya. And then everyone who joined us came with the same opening words, I like your research. So probably it will be a mutual, or rather Yevgenia's admiration society here, which I very much welcome, because it just occurred to me that I first read Yevgenia's research and writings as a publicist about 30 years ago. Could you believe it? She was almost a child at that time. And it was in Moskovsky Novosti, the Moscow News, one of the earlier perestroika or glasnost newspapers. And from then on, for 30 years, I agree with everything she writes and says, so that almost exhausts my comments. The only thing which I could add to that, this notion of authoritarian,
Military authoritarian, bureaucratic military authoritarianism.
Yeah, bureaucratic military security forces, right? Authoritarianism. It occurs to me that it could be dated at least 30 years earlier, maybe 100 years earlier, or maybe hundreds of years earlier in Russia. But that's probably too general an observation. I think it was also the same in the Soviet Union, despite even Stalin was supposed to be a single dictator, which he was on one hand, but on the other hand, he created, or he was promoted by a new class, which was actually heir to the old ways, old bureaucracies, not necessarily the top level of Tsarist bureaucracy, but at least peasants brought to capitals, to St. Petersburg and Moscow, a lot of their habits and ways, and heavily affected the course of the Soviet Union. So my impression is that this kind of structure is coming in kind of vicious circles. Why is it coming repetitiously, even after major upheavals or major revolutionary events, which look on the surface at least as a major revolutionary events, like in 1917 or 1980, and then in our times? That's, to my mind, a little bit of mystery of history. It's not poetical, it's just so happened that history, mystery, mystery, history. But anyway, so that's what I can offer as a debris of both Soviet and failed democratic regime in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Gene, let me ask a specific question. Perhaps I should have foreshadowed this before. What do you think of the corporatist thesis in the paper? And what is the meaning of that for developments going forward in Russia? Your take, please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for the lead. It's hard to argue with such, eminent personalities and people who really know firsthand the development of the Russian system. I think there is a certain amount of tension in the thesis by Dr. Albats, in that the corporatist system, to my mind, implies a degree of competition among various corporatist entities. It's not an authoritarian regime, whereas, as I think you describe it both in the paper and in your presentation, you paint a much more authoritarian, if not totalitarian system. At least that's how I read it, because There is just really one corporation or one clan that is in charge. And as I was reading your paper and thinking about my own very brief remarks, I couldn't help but think that our record of analysis and prediction of Russian domestic politics is really pretty poor over the last 30 years. We, as a community of analysts, have failed multiple times to predict the major pivotal points in the evolution of, or revolutions in Russian domestic politics. And looking forward to the next 6 years, because I think of Russian sort of movement in Russian domestic politics in terms of presidential terms, and we're about a month away or so, a little more than a month away from the next presidential election. I have to say that I really don't see much possibility of change in the system that, to my mind, came into being probably in the early or mid-90s. I think some have described it as a clan-based system, and I think it still survives. By that time, the fundamental ideological differences in Russian society really went away, and what was left was basically competition for power and property among various clans, or you can call them interest groups, but again, interest groups implies, at least in our political science, a greater degree of pluralism and openness in the system. And the system survives to the present day. It was facilitated to a very large extent by the 1993 Constitution, which created the super presidency that in the 1990s was very weak and basically reduced to one clan, the family. It was centered in the Kremlin, but a number of other clans rose to prominence and really probably in those days justified the name of being oligarchs. But since then, we've seen considerable change in the balance of power between the Kremlin and these clans. And the Kremlin, perhaps, as Dr. Albats pointed out, reinforced by the power ministries, really gained the upper hand. And for pretty much the entirety of the past 18 years, the time that Putin has been in office, really has asserted itself as much more than first among equals in this arrangement. But the competition among various interests still survives. I don't think it's been completely eliminated. And at times when the system feels a sense of uncertainty or weakness, as was the case in 2007 and 2008, at the time of President Putin's end of his second term and questions about transition, there was considerable flux in the system. And I think we may be coming up on something similar in the years to come. This is not to say by any means that we're approaching a major transition in Russian domestic politics. All signs point to a pretty stable arrangement with very few internal challenges and very few external challenges, I would say. But this uncertainty about what will happen post-2024, post Mr. Putin's next term, I think opens up the conversation in a way that it has not been opened up until now. For the next 6 years, I emphasize the system appears to be quite able to handle the uncertainty and any sources of domestic discontent or challenge. And certainly we're seeing elements of domestic discontent now. Dr. Albats has been very prominent in promoting and describing the candidacy, or rather the non-candidacy, I should say at this point, of Alexei Navalny. But it's clear to my mind that he has struck a certain chord in Russian domestic politics, which at present doesn't really amount to a major political challenge to the system. But again, I think there's a degree of uncertainty there and challenge domestic to the system that we ought to be thinking about in serious ways. I don't think it's going to be really a systemic change, but a realignment perhaps. And just last but not least, and my question would be to both my colleagues who spoke before me, and Sandy, perhaps to you too. What do you make of this very strange presidential campaign with Navalny essentially being marginalized, but in terms of the process, but still playing a hugely important role, I think, as a voice for many in the young generation. And then there is the candidacy of Ksenia Sobchak, who at first seemed to be handpicked by the Kremlin, but clearly...
For the prayer bracket.
Yes, that's right.
Right, who's going to be in Washington apparently soon. But that again raises a very uncomfortable question, I think, for the system, how to handle it, because just her sheer presence and raising of questions in the public sphere seems to make the Kremlin uncomfortable. And the same goes for the Communist Party candidate, Grudinin, who also seems to be pushing the boundaries of the conversation that up until now has been quite stilted, quite constrained. So I think in the follow-on to our prepared remarks, we ought to consider the next 6 years. And I'm tempted to say in conclusion that the title of this panel really is the direction of Russian domestic politics. I think of it as going in cycles or in circles, but I think, you know, maybe it's a movement along a spiral, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Sandy, any comment on the corporatist thesis, what's said before, and also specifically on foreign policy side of this, if any?
Okay. Well, thanks very much, and it's great to be on a panel with Yevgenia, who back in the early Putin days when I was ambassador taught me a lot about the system as it was already beginning to emerge back then. I'm quite convinced that by the case in your paper that the regime has become more like a corporation than a personal dictatorship, although obviously it has elements of both. But I think some of the statistics that you've marshaled are quite impressive, and they're also extremely depressing in terms of the new nomenclatura being what you call a boogie monster in the paper, with steady growth in its dominance of all levels of the system. With KGB and FSB veterans, I was particularly intrigued by some of the anecdotes. I urge everyone to read the paper when it's issued, which highlight the role of some key institutions, the Federal Security Guard Service, the Service for the Protection of the Cultural Order, which are, under different names during the Soviet period, have been instrumental in suppressing dissent and protecting the strength of the regime. And there's some interesting anecdotes about how Putin's orders seem to have been even overridden, which kind of creates more evidence behind this idea of a corporatist structure rather than a single strongman calling all the shots. Although at one point you suggest that the corporation is dictating to Putin, I think that's a little too strong. They still need him as the dispenser of the illicit wealth. And of course, he is one of them, so it's not like they have a different agenda. But I think the rest of the corporation needs Putin's popularity, some of which is genuine in the sense of being the anti-Yeltsin who brought a certain degree of stability to Russia. So they're all in this together. But the paper leaves me convinced that if Putin were to get run over by a bus tomorrow, like-minded people would be poised to take his place, at least in the short term. Whether the other members of the corporation could maintain the cohesion among themselves is an open question. I'm less convinced that the younger generation are going to be a force for liberalization, at least in the short term, but at least it's a hopeful theory that we can hope pans out down the road. But this is clearly something which is not new. Today's KGB Incorporated, or whatever you want to call it, is the culmination of trends that began in Putin's first term. When I was ambassador, we saw the increasing intolerance of real opposition, the shift to a rubber stamp parliament, the taming of the independent media, suppression of at least NGOs engaged in human rights activities, and of course the hostile, xenophobic attitude towards the foreign backers of civil society. One of the first U.S. programs to get the axe during my time was the Peace Corps, and that now virtually all assistance and exchange programs have been shut down. So it is still quite startling to hear the director of the FSB, Mr. Bortnikov, justify the repressions of the 1930s But I actually recall when I had occasional meetings with then FSB Director Patrushev that he said equally hair-raising things, although in private. And of course, he's now head of the Security Council. So the trends were clear at the beginning of Putin's time, but they become even more stark 18 years later. So here we are, less than 2 months away from the imitation presidential election that's scheduled on the 18th of March. As I see it, well, it's interesting to watch the protests, which were significant over the weekend. Still, I think the regime has been relatively successful in pushing opposition to the margins, in containing it without having to use excessive force. They're being careful not to make Navalny into a martyr, but I fear that if he is successful with the boycott and deprives Putin of his 70 times 70% turnout, 70% approval in the so-called election, harsher measures could come. Remembering that the assassination of Boris Nemtsov has to have been signed off at senior levels of the regime. Now, what does this mean for Russian policy, as you asked, John? I believe that the priority that the leaders of this corporation attach to a strong state and to suppression of pro-Western opposition will translate into a continued confrontational policy toward the West, whether it's under Putin or any successor. The leaders of this corporation really believe that their own propaganda, that the United States and its allies are bent on regime change in Russia, and that the United States, through its support for civil society and for democratic values, is responsible for any pro-Western movements that develop, whether it's in Ukraine and Georgia or in Russia itself. And of course, the fear that successful liberalization in the near abroad could infect Russia itself, I think, has been the main driver of the increasing crackdown at home. But it's also, I think, the main driver in Russia's more aggressive foreign policy. Moreover, portraying Russia as encircled by a hostile NATO and threatened by a Russophobic West, it makes it a lot easier to justify the economic stagnation that Russia is now experiencing, declining living standards. If there were a serious effort at rapprochement with the West, it would create new pressures to reform the system, which I don't think are likely beyond maybe cosmetic steps over the next 6 years. And having unleashed full-blooded Russian nationalism with the annexation of Crimea and all the rhetoric about defending the Russian world, Putin or any other leader will be, I think, very wary about entering into deals that would have to be defended against nationalists at home, such as a deal to genuinely pull out of the Donbass and hand the valiant Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics back to Ukraine. It's not impossible, and I think the Trump administration is right to try to test the Russians at the bargaining table with the current discussions about a possible UN peacekeeping force. But at the end of the day, the leaders of this KGB-led system may see little payoff in making the kinds of concessions that would be needed to rebuild cooperation with the West. Rather, they will opt for continued efforts to weaken and divide the West, to command attention to Russia more as a spoiler than as a partner or a problem solver. And they'll hitch Russia's wagon, I think, to other states that also reject the US-led international order, particularly countries like China, which doesn't fully reject that order, or Iran. So for the United States and its allies, this means that we need to continue to prepare ourselves for a period of long-term strategic competition with Russia, bolstering our own defenses, strengthening our countermeasures against destabilization, disinformation, hybrid warfare, trying to support the resilience of Russia's neighbors, and going back to the Cold War toolbox in terms of trying to manage the competition using arms control, confidence-building measures, and the like, while recognizing that the Russians these days seem to prefer to be unpredictable, untransparent, But we still have a duty to our own people to try to at least limit this competition as best we can.
Well, that was a rather gloomy analysis. All right. Before I turn the floor over to you again, Dr. Albats, I want to make one point. I forgot to mention when I started that this series of events, today's presentation, we owe our sponsor, the Scey Foundation in Pittsburgh, for sponsoring this, and we're grateful to them for it. Now, Dr. Albats, I was wondering if you could pick up specifically on the question Gene raised relating to the current presidential election, the Navalny candidacy, and for that matter, the Sobchak candidacy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I would definitely respond to this. It's a very interesting question with what they call elections in Russia. However, I think it's very important to point out, one thing, I would like to, if I may,
please,
to respond to what Minister Kozyrev said. It's true that political policy in Russia historically has had a very prominent role. It's true. It was under in the Tsarist Russia. There was so-called third department, Akhranka. Of course, in the Soviet times, political policy, the KGB, and the VCK, which was born in 1918, was set up as a political police. We have documents. We know this. However, having said that, I would say that never before in the Russian history political police was in charge. It's always been either under the control of the Tsarist administration, or in the Soviet times it was competing with the most important institution in the country. That's the Communist Party, which was of course wasn't a party, was the form of governance, and there were two vertical structures in the Soviet Union. The Communist Party, which went all the way from Moscow to the smallest towns in the country, and the same was true with the KGB. These were competing institutions. The very first time in the history of Russia, the political police is in charge. It is the essence of the state, and it sees itself as a protector of the state, and it is state itself. Just to give you an example, there is a change in faces. However, if you scratch, you always find one and the same background. As I do on it became my hobby. So 2015, president of the country, the graduate of the KGB, chief of his administration, Sergei Ivanov, graduate of the KGB, speaker of the parliament, graduate of the KGB, heads of the corporations, heads of the agencies, etc., etc. So it is in a way, it is a very new reality, and I ask you not to underestimate that's very new reality. Second, when we say it's more unpredictable, I would disagree with you, because from my perspective, it's more predictable than the one-man rule. It's very difficult to get into the head of that of Putin's, but we do know the rules of the game that existed inside the KGB. For instance, we do know, the set of enemies that that existed in the Soviet Union. We more or less can predict how these tools and instruments will be used in this old new order. And we see it. The recreation, as Ambassador Vershbow reminded us, the recreation of the Department to Protect Constitution, it is the former, at the time, in the Soviet time, it was the famous ideological counterintelligence 5th Directorate. that fought, dissidents, etc. The Department to Protect the Constitutional Order now is fighting universities. It was this department that destroyed the best advanced political science school in the country, European University in St. Petersburg. It is this department who is in charge of the case of theatrical director Kirill Serebrennikov, and so it goes. I mean, for somebody like me who lived my life in Russia, in a way, I feel almost nostalgic. I feel, it's, as if they are bringing back the time when I was young and okay. Now, totalitarian. No, it's not going to be a total state. There are several reasons for that, and one is that it's a market economy, and as you may or may not remember, that back in 1980s, when even earlier than that, when Andropov was the head of the KGB, Andropov, who then became the member of the Politburo and then the general secretary of the Communist Party, the leader of the Soviet Union, when he was the head of the KGB, he created inside the KGB groups of people who developed the conception of the market economy, of the transformation of the Soviet plant system into, they didn't use the term market economy, but basically they were toying with the kind of semi-capitalism that existed in then Yugoslavia, with the elements of private property on land that existed in Poland, and et cetera, et cetera. So these market forces and these KGB people, they're all involved in the market economy. And obviously, we already see the competition between different groups inside the same corporation, inside the same clan. For instance, Mr. Chemezov, who, of course, you're well aware, who served with Putin in Dresden during the Soviet times, and the KGB Residentur in Dresden, it's East Germany. He's the head of Rostech, which is, the industrial company consisted of some 400, almost 500 different industrial enterprises. These companies tend to be more interested in closing Russia, in closing market from the competitors from the other countries, West included. Whereas, for instance, Igor Sechin, who is the head of a very powerful guy, who is the head of Rosneft, it's an energy company. He has trouble now because of the sanctions imposed by the United States, because of, they're unable to develop, to drill oil in Arctica because of those sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. These are competing forces. They're going to compete. They're doomed to compete. And this will not allow for any total state. There will be no total state. Point one. Point two, there is no ideology. They're trying to promote Russian Orthodoxy as a substitution for the communist ideology. It will not work. 10% of Russians go to the church. Wait a second, in the country where stats claim that there are from 70 to 80% of citizens who understand themselves as Russian Orthodox, but only 10% go to the church. It's very much, the absence of ideology won't allow for and it's a prerequisite for the total state. Putin. He's not, obviously he's a middleman and he will serve as a front for the corporation. However, I think he made a crucial mistake when he got carried out by the notion of revenge in 2014 with the success of Maidan in Ukraine. He got carried by this notion of revenge, and it resulted in the annexation of Crimea and Russian forces in the eastern Ukraine. As a result of that, he gave up on the other forces inside his own government, which were more liberal to a certain extent. And he became the hostage of the information that was coming out from the FSB and etc. Now, so you will know there will be reform in the next several months, when, intelligence will be back under the auspices of the FSB and bodyguards. They're totally recreating, not bodyguards, the Federal Security Service. They're totally recreating the structure of the KGB, totally, just, with no exception. So he became just the hostage of that. All the analysis is done by the analytical department of the FSB. The decision-making body is his Security Council, which is staffed, of course, with the KGB people, with General Patrushev on top of that, and then Bortnikov and his deputies. So he himself made a hostage of that situation, and I don't think there is a way out for him. Now, upcoming elections. Alexei Navalny, of course, the most talented politician, opposition leader in Russia, and he's a very talented politician. I know him for the last 14 years, and trust me, he's the one who is capable to evolve and learn, and he's written a hell of a lot. When he was under house arrest for a year, he read so much books, and whenever he's in jail, I never pass there any food or anything. I always, books, and that's great. He's extremely devoted and talented politician. He created the whole structure over the last year. He created the whole structure all across Russia, from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. 84 outposts of his organization existed now in the Russian provinces. All of a sudden, people in Kremlin realized that dissent and opposition is not just in Moscow and St. Petersburg or the big cities, but dissent existed out in the Russian provinces as well. As a result of that, thousands of people came out on the rallies that were conducted by Navalny in Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, Omsk, Kemerovo. You don't know these cities. The majority of you never heard about that. This is a very, very Russian periphery. It's what we call the third Russia. Now, why Sobchak? Very easy. There is a problem of turnout. That's the biggest problem that Kremlin is preoccupied with. Of course, Putin is going to proclaim to get, whatever, percent, it doesn't matter, and he's going to be reappointed as the president of the Russian Federation. I refuse to use the word выборы, choice, because there is no really choice here. It's not the question whether he's going to be elected or not. It's the question of legitimacy. Legitimacy is a very vague idea in political science. It's not legal. We can talk about legality in terms of specific laws, constitutions, this kind of legal institutions. Legitimacy is something when people do. The majority of people in the particular territory do recognize ex quasi guy as the leader of the country. So the problem is that, as it was shown during the latest parliamentary elections, big cities don't vote for the party in power. During the last parliamentary elections in Moscow, there was, United Russia got something like 13%, in St. Petersburg, I believe 13.4%, and so it goes, from 13 to 20%. That's the most they got in the cities, in the industrial cities all across Russia of the Russian Federation. So the problem is that, of course, the way the United Russia and Putin back in 2012, they're getting these huge approval numbers and and percentage, is through so-called electoral sultanates. That's how political scientists in my part of the world call National Republic in Russia, like Chechnya, Ingushetia, Karakalpakia, and so it goes. In 2012, I believe Putin got in a couple of places in Chechnya 106%. And they were unable to understand why all of us were just laughing at this, because they thought that's great, 106%, right? And of course it is. So these electoral sultanates, plus territories which are under firm control of the presidential administration, like Kemerovo, Saratov, and some others, they do give from 10 to 15% added to the vote. However, as it was obvious in 2012, when Putin didn't get the majority, he got less than 50% in Moscow, and less than 50%, almost less than 50% in St. Petersburg. In order for him to be a legitimate president, in order for him not to be called the president of periphery, but the president of the country, he has to get votes from the people in the Russian industrial cities. And that's precisely why Kremlin and Sergei Kirienko, that was his idea, chose Ksenia Sobchak as a substitution, as a vehicle to get the desirable turnout. The idea was very easy one. The idea was that that when Kremlin, I mean, not Kremlin, de facto, it's called CIK, Central Election Committee, Commission, but of course you understand that all of them are just puppets. So when they denied Navalny registration, the expectations were that these will bring thousands of people, young people in the streets, just the way it happened on March 26 and on June 12, when all of a sudden, young people all across Russia went out on the streets when Navalny called them for these anti-corruption actions. It was wow, not just for Kremlin, of course, they don't have a real feedback, so therefore, it's, but even for us, we didn't expect this to happen. So that became a nightmare for the presidential administration that, young people were going to come out on the streets. The minute, it was going to be announced that Navalny was not going to be registered as a candidate. Just so by the Russian law, those who are trying to get registered as candidates, they have to be voted by people in different cities. 16,000 young people came out on the streets in different cities, and they said, we want Navalny to be our candidate. So therefore, they decided that they need somebody who is going to grab part of Navalny's electoral base. And of course, Ksenia Sobchak is the best. She's extremely talented, she's smart, talented, and let's give her credit. The kind of things that she's allowed to say on Channel 1 and Channel 2, these propaganda channels, major TV channels that, get to over 90% of households all across Russian time zones. They've never heard the word like annexation of Crimea. They never heard that. And in fact, it was the violation of the international law, what happened on March 18, 2014. This is important. Words do have meaning. It's important that she comes out and says all this kind of things. But of course, the major idea behind her, what's the
candidacy?
Candidacy, of course, is an attempt to increase the turnout in the big cities. So that's as simple as that. But she's very talented. Let's give her credit. She's very talented. Okay.
That was a tour de force. And I want to get to our questions, but I'll give each of our panelists 1 minute for any comments they'd like to make. Mr. Minister, do you want to add?
I agree with everything which was said.
Gene?
Well, let's go to the audience.
Okay. Sandy?
I'll wait for the
Okay.
questions.
Questions, right here first. That was wonderful.
We have a microphone.
Oh, wait, wait for the microphone, and please identify yourself.
Thank you very much. This is the Voice of America Russian Service. Zhenya, thank you very, very, very much for your explanation, and I mostly agree with. The thing is, what struck me is your difference of assessment between you and Ambassador Vershbow about the Putin's role, because you say Putin is a hostage, almost a hostage. Ambassador is saying that, for example, the killing of Boris Nemtsov was signed on senior levels, more senior than Kadyrov, which I personally not agree.
I'm sorry, you say what?
It wasn't Putin.
I said that.
But okay, anyway.
I didn't say that either.
The question to you is, to what extent Putin is a hostage, and can he like fed up with this role? Can he, on his next term, which is at least 6 years, can think of again authoritarian power and not to be the front company for the whole different interests which are competing now? And to Ambassador Vershbow, what indicates to you that many of these major decisions, like killing of Bosnians or for invasion of Crimea, is making by Putin himself? In what, how to say, how much he's in control? What do you think? In foreign politics too.
Daniel, thank you very much for your question. Let me put it this way. He's a willing hostage. It happened by, it's the outcome of the institutional design. He's going to be the face of this corporation. I never met him, but I follow what he says and what he does very closely as a journalist. I would say that he's pretty smart. And there is no way that he doesn't understand the dire situation he finds himself now. I would remind you that Stalin, in a way, found himself in the same situation when he kicked out everybody around him. There was no Politburo, no ЦК, no anything, and there was the NKVD with bloodthirsty guys who were killing everybody around. But there was a tool that Stalin had. He was killing layer after layer of Chekists. His instrument was his ability to appoint the new guy as the head of the NKVD, and this new guy, his first task was to kill everybody from before. Yagoda was sacked. Everybody around Yagoda, Yagoda, the head of the NKVD, was killed, or the majority. Yezhov fulfilled his duty. He was sacked, killed, and the whole layer of interrogators, I spent quite some time in my life, investigating this period, were killed. The same, with Beria, with him, then with Abakumov, and etc. That's the kind of instrument that you have when, there is when there is a dictatorship and you deal with the corporation. I doubt that Putin is anywhere close to being Stalin. He doesn't have, the resources and ability, etc., to do this. Therefore, he's doomed to become, hostage to the corporation. That's the institutional design.
And it does mean that competition will develop then.
Inside, there is always, cleavages inside this type of corporations. Cleavages, generation-wise, interest-wise, and etc. So different kind of competition inside the corporation are unavoidable. And that's very nice because, when they compete with each other, they have less resources to kill us. I'm sorry. I have some personal stakes, after all.
Yeah. I agree. There are cleavages, divisions. There is a competition within the elite. I'm uncomfortable with treating him, though, as a hostage, even a willing hostage. I think Putin does have many advantages. He is primus inter pares, but a very big primus vis-a-vis the other parts of the elite. And he's able, I think, to maintain his primacy in a number of ways in terms of how he doles out the economic assets. I think particularly what's interesting in the last few years is how he's been replacing a lot of the regional elites, the governors, the polpreds, with younger technocratic KGB people. They're still KGB people, but people that are more likely to owe their loyalty to him than to anybody else. So I think he's finding a number of ways to kind of ensure his strong primus inter pares position. And I think we don't know a lot about the inner workings of political decision making, including on big issues like the invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. But I think there's enough of a record of Putin's statements, dismissing Ukraine as even being a real country, and his gut belief that the CIA and Victoria Nuland and all these people are actively promoting revolutions in the near abroad, in the former Soviet republics, I think suggests that this was a very personal issue for them. He felt that he was being personally betrayed and undermined, and I think there's a lot of evidence that the decision to go and to annex Crimea, which was the step he didn't need to take, he could have done another frozen conflict. I think that was very much Putin. Now, did he have supporters? Did he consult with people and sort of make sure that he wasn't going against the consensus? I'm sure that was the case. But the other thing, I think, Putin, unlike a lot of these faceless members of this new nomenclatura, does have a personal standing with the people. He maintains that. He cultivates it with the big TV interview every year, with staged outreach events to the public, as we're seeing during his so-called election campaign. So he can bank on a bit of popular support, even if it's going to be inflated in terms of the actual vote count, that some of these other characters don't have. The question for me is, is he going to become a lame duck? The next six years is going to be interesting. He could, as he could have done after a second term, change the Constitution and allow himself to run, or they could create some new honorific super presidency that, as the Vozhd, that could allow him to stay in power till he dies. But at the moment, though, that's an open question, and so there could be more jockeying after this election, after the dust settles, among other members of the elite, as they try to get the upper hand before they get purged and replaced by someone more identified with Putin.
Thank you. Question over here. Harlan.
Thanks. I'm Harlan Ullman. I'm a recovering Sovietologist. I want to ask my question sort of tongue-in-cheek with two observations.
Sovietologist.
Listening to what you're saying suggested to me that you could have been talking about America as well as Russia. Senior politicians come in.
Would you want us to change places? I give you my
senior
apartment
politicians,
in Moscow, okay?
senior politicians come in with their own teams. Bill Clinton brought the Rose Law Firm and his cronies from Little Rock. W. brought his father's team with him. Obama brought his Chicago Mafia, and Donald Trump has brought his business people from New York largely. So I think that there's something here. Second, I would make the observation, I think Putin is getting bored because dealing with the West is too easy. We spend 20 times on defense than he does. He takes these small little steps and we overreact. And so my question is, what do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of Russia today, and how is the West and the United States best postured to deal with them in more sensible policies? Because right now, I think Putin is running circles around us. I think that we are awkward, and I think we're clumsy, and to the degree that we need to be smarter, perhaps we need to focus on the obvious strengths and weaknesses of Russia to design better policies, because the current ones, to me, don't seem to be working.
May I ask you, when was the last time you were to Moscow?
I go every year to the Moscow Security Conference. I meet with Lavrov and Shoigu and a lot of the heavy hitters.
Then, I mean, God, you have such great conversators. There is need for me to explain you that simple things that they can do this, right? I think, all this, rhetoric about the comparison between the United States and Russia is just...
I think you missed my point. That's not what I was saying. I was being slightly tongue-in-cheek in terms of saying that leaders bring their teams with them, and it should be no shock that the KGB, which was where Putin was raised, he was going to bring his colleagues just as American presidents bring their teams with them too.
How many political appointees in Washington, D.C.?
I missed your question.
How many political appointees in Washington, D.C.?
There should be around 4,000.
4,000.
4,000, of which only a handful really count.
So we are talking about the numbers. I would say probably 100 times more than 4,000. We're talking about people who are trying very hard to control not just decision-making sphere in Moscow, but all across the country. We're talking about the people who are tempting with the statistical data in the regions in order to influence decision-making in Moscow. We're talking about people who make wise deputy governors to present wrong data with respect to mortality rates and, and diseases and et cetera, et cetera. It's just impossible even to compare. Either you really don't understand the way Russia is governed, or I really have no idea the way the system existed in the United States, even though I have a minor in American politics from Harvard University. So I'm unable to answer your question. I'm sorry.
Okay. Gene, you want to jump in?
Answer the question, because I take your point and all, but we do have competitive elections. Let's just say that, and move on to the question that I think is far more important that you raise, for how we can position ourselves to deal with Russia. And I think that's a key question for us to answer, because for the past 30 years, we have pursued the same policy toward Russia. Inevitably, with every new administration coming in, promising to make things better, and inevitably finding leaving the relationship to its successor in a much worse shape than it found it in. So I think it's also important to recognize that the successive administrations, despite their ideological differences, have approached Russia with basically the same ideological mindset. You can call it the end of history, you can call it whatever, but the expectation was that Russia would change and become like us. Well, that clearly hasn't happened. So I think we need to go back to really rethinking our Russia policy, something that in the rush to impose multiple sanctions on Russia, we have really not done. Sanctions are not a policy. It's a tool, but we have not really answered the question of what it is we want from Russia, what our interest is in Russia, around Russia, in the territories that are currently being contested, and I think that's the first step, and then the rest will flow from that.
Okay. Question over here.
Agnia Grigas, Atlantic Council. I have a question for a guest from Russia, and I'm sure you believe in the future of your country, and I can see that you're both great patriots. I wanted to ask if, when do you think that better future will come for Russia? When do you think Russia could really emerge as a democracy and not be a threat to its neighbors? Do you think this is a matter of decades, 50 years, 100 years? I would love to hear your thoughts.
Smith, you want to give it a shot?
Me? I really not, I don't know how to read the crystal ball. That's my problem. I'm a journalist. I'm 59-year-old. I hate to think that I'm going to die under Putin. That's it. That's all I have to answer for that.
You want to give this a shot?
Yeah. Yes, crystal ball. I left it in my home. Unfortunately, I didn't know that you would come with this question. But actually, it's connected to the previous discussion. I think it was actually a very, very acute observation and a very good question. I think America is itching slowly to better understanding and better reacting to Russia. First of all, it started under Obama. I like Obama. I think he was one of the greatest American presidents. but he was a little slow, timid, kind of in moving on some issues like Syria or Russia. But anyway, however slowly, but America is approaching today, even probably with reluctant White House, but the Congress definitely seems to be on the right track, especially with this last law, which was passed overwhelmingly. If I remember correctly, it was 98 senators. I mean, 98 senators, and almost 400 members of the House. That law, along with previously adopted Magnitsky law, that is more accurate. It does not speak of Russia. Actually, this is misuse of words. The better way is to speak of the regime, is like exemplary. Zhenya, I told you that you will hear everything you need to know from her, that it's the regime. It's not even necessarily only Putin himself, but the regime which is not only different from Russia, should be taken differently, but interests of this regime, of this corporation, whatever it is contrary to fundamental national interests of Russia. So as long as America and the West tries to talk to Russian diplomats or whatever political class, arguing for national interests of Russia, of course, it is contrary to Russian national interests to fight with Ukraine, who are our brothers. It is even further from national interests to take a military adventure somewhere, nowhere in Syria, where there are no interests for Russia, real interests. So, but the regime is different. So now they started from Magnitsky Act to the last legislation, and the list, however you evaluate this list, but the list was published just a few days, maybe 2 days ago, or 1 day ago. That is much more closer to addressing the regime and dealing with the regime and finding, you said something about strong and weak points in Russia, or yes, that's the Achilles heel of the regime, of the political class, however defined. The rules, the interest of this regime was, I mean, simplistically, steal in Russia, spend in the West. Keep Russian people under the KGB legacy so that they sit calm, and keep them under propaganda, Soviet time or even Tsarist time. But spend in the West, in democracy, in a legal system. If you deprive them from that second part, or threaten them considerably, ability to spend time, money, and have their families and everything in the Western side, on the Western side, then you will start addressing the Achilles heel. And that's what is happening, and I hope that on this road they start to heed, not only to you know, play bravado like they are playing. I mean, take it easy. It's just a bravado. But in fact, it never was in the cards for this political class in Russia to be sitting in the small Soviet Union called Putin's Russia or whatever. And that was for the people, not for them. So that's the game changer. And how they react, there are many ways how they can react. They are powerful, they are politically powerful, financially powerful. They know each other quite well. There is potential for all kind of tricks, all kind of interpretations. So I feel rather optimistic for America, as usually trying all the wrong approaches, but finally coming to the right one. So I am probably in the right place myself.
I'm afraid we have time for only one more question. I think this gentleman over here has got it.
Oleg Merkulov, Business Baltia Media Group from Riga, Latvia. So would you explain one interesting phenomenon? In Latvia we have hundreds of TV stations, hundreds of radio stations. We listen to Echo Moskvy, Polny Albats, very good program, by the way. And but last parliamentary elections, Russian citizens residing in Latvia, 75% of them voted for Eurasia. And if you take Russian ethnic Russians living in Latvia, both Latvian citizens or so-called non-citizens, those who are deprived of voting even in municipal elections, support of them for personally Putin, not Eurasia, would go at least 90%. How would you explain that?
Actually, one more question over here. You answered the two questions together. No, for you.
Trudy Rubin, columnist, The Philadelphia Inquirer. I would like to ask how the Russian adventure in Syria fits into what you have been describing. Has the motivation changed? Does this add or detract from legitimacy? And has the weakness of Western response, US response, fed an appetite for a new Russian adventurism abroad?
Anyone? We have two questions. Sandy, you want to take the first shot?
Okay, I'll leave to colleagues why Putin is getting so many votes among Russians in Latvia. But on the second one, I think the original Russian objective was limited to sort of saving the regime from collapse. And this is because Russia viewed it as yet another example of US promotion of regime change. Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, Assad would be next. But I do think the agenda got more ambitious after the initial success. And Russia realized, in part because of the incoherence of the US and Western policy, that it could make deeper inroads and become one of the arbiters of the future direction of Syria. Getting it across the finish line may prove far more difficult in terms of any kind of diplomatic outcome that could kind of stitch the country back together, even in a loose confederation. So the Russians may have bitten off more than they could chew, but so far I don't think they think it's was a mistake. Will this fuel the Russian appetite? I think you can see that it already has in terms of their expanding their relations with other long-standing U.S. allies like Egypt, playing around with General Haftar in Libya. So they will push on as many open doors like the thief in the hotel. We need to do a better job in locking the doors.
Well, I think it's somewhat of a misnomer to call it an adventure. I think it was a calculated move. They have long-standing interest in the Middle East. They've been dealing with the Assad family for over 40 years. This was their last outpost in the Middle East. And they felt they had the means, the necessary interests, and really the opportunity to walk in and do what they felt was important. And I think it's not a question of them sort of feeling emboldened, but I think we're dealing with a very different Russian foreign policy post, call it 2014 or post 2012, and the 12 was the return of Mr. Putin to the Kremlin as president. And you know, they've been acting with newfound confidence, I would say, in a number of places. You could say that a lot of these are really opportunities for bottom feeding, so to speak, such as bailing out the Maduro regime in Venezuela. But you know, these opportunities come up, they'll take advantage of them because they can.
Mr. Minister, any comments?
The interest in Syria, probably I was invited as a former foreign minister to tell you an anecdote, so I will do that. Now, I flew to Syria in, I think it was 1993, and met his father, the Assad father, the old Hafez Assad, yes, old friend of the Soviet Union. And I was thinking actually of our interests, of course, and my main interest was to persuade him to behave, so to say, at least more moderately, like moderate, also, by the way, dictatorships around there in the larger Arab area, for the interest of general interest of stability in the Middle East. But my special interest was to ask, especially due to the very, very low price of oil, which we suffered from economically in our time, our government. So our interest was to see whether he would pay at least some of the debt which we counted as a debt to the Soviet Union, and we inherited the debt. And our count was around 12 or something billion dollars. At that time, it would be dream well to have even half of that or quarter of that. So, and when I said that, Mr. President, we are old friends, I mean, like Moscow and Damascus, and what about the debt? He was mesmerized. Sincerely, he was an old man, but he looked at me and said, you know, it's unbelievable. For 30 years, or I don't remember how many, but decades, I am a dictator here. How many?
20-something.
20-something. I used to entertain Andrei from Moscow, that is Andrei Gromyko, who were coming to me and telling me to stay firm against American imperialism and Israeli Zionism. And he was giving me weapons for that. So I was standing there like a soldier with a weapon given to me to stand against the enemy. Now, here comes another Andrei, younger Andrei from Moscow. And he tells me that my service for 20 years was totally misguided, that he has no responsibility for my service, not only, I mean, a degree of respect to that, but he tells me that I have to reverse the service. And more of that, that I have to pay for the weapon which was given to me on my duty. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And actually, when I was listening to him, I thought, Jesus Christ, there is a reason in what he says. I mean, later on, I was reluctant to do that, but later on, I think they just kind of, there was a shenanigans, of course, like always, so somebody probably got rich on this transaction, but mostly he never paid anything. I mean, for real. But anyway, his son, I mean, yes, it's probably the same interest which had the previous Andrei. Looking from Kremlin in their eyes, and I think the Hafiz exhaled when he saw Primakov as my successor. So as early as mid-90s, the old interest came into the Assad family, stand against American. It's not imperialism now, it's hegemony. I think it's like hegemony, right? Or one country domination or whatever. I mean, single policy world, whatever the wording. So, but the essence is the same.
Albats.
In the lieu with Minister Kozyrev, I will answer with an anecdote. I was traveling across Baltics, you know, the Estonia and Latvia last summer in August. And, you know, people from, you know, some organization in Estonia invited me to give a talk, and I was happy to do that because it was a long time since I was in the former republics of the Soviet Union. Anyway, so there was some party afterwards, which ended up with somebody saying, quote, "Good Russian, dead Russian." At which point I I said, "Thank you so much, but no more," and left the party. So it is, I mean, with all due respect, I understand the suffering of the Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia as a result of the Soviet occupation. And so many hundreds of thousands of Latvians, Estonians, and Lithuanians, they got perished in Gulag and Siberia. However, it's not easy thing to be a Russian speaker in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania nowadays. You probably know this better than I do. That's my explanation to the fact that those who, that Russian population, Russian speakers in these countries, they do vote United Russia or they love Putin. However, when there was a research conducted with respect to whether those Russian speakers would love to leave the European Union and go back to Russia, the absolute majority said no. And especially after the ruble collapsed at the end of 2014, it turned out that medical insurance in the European Union turned out to be much better than the one they could get in Russia. And that was one of the reasons. No. Yeah. There is no medical insurance, Andrei, in Russia anymore. Anyway, I'm sorry. So, so therefore, you know, I think that we should be very careful with all these polls, and we shouldn't take at the face value what people say to the pollsters. I also want to say that we never touched this question, but I really believe that if you know, in the lieu with my hypothesis about the corporation which is taking over of Russian internal and external politics, I would say that we should expect the type of foreign policy which will be based on there will be active measure operations, clandestine operations, very pragmatic, very different from what existed in the during the Soviet times. So don't try to figure out the Russians' foreign policy out of what existed under Soviets. For instance, my understanding, I don't want to, just my understanding of this whole Syria operation is just it is, an active measure operation that Putin needed because, he saw the success, the PR effect of the Crimea annexation in Russia, and he was looking for something that would prolong this effect. But apparently Russians give a lip service to what's happening in Syria, so it didn't work. But I think that, that will be, the kind of things that we should expect. Thank you so much.
Dr. Albats, thank you. All of our panelists, thank you. Thank the Scey Foundation. Thank all the audience.
Thank you.